the Russians have got this extraordinary ability to take punishment. We saw it in the Second World War, and they'll just grind on and on and on. And this brings us, I think, to the biggest danger. I think the biggest danger is that Putin says to Trump, "Actually, if you don't mind, I'm not going to do a deal. I'm just going to keep going." And then what happens?
We heard from Trump's national security advisor that the president-elect could speak to President Putin as early as next week about the war in Ukraine. What do you expect to hear from that conversation? And do you think that's starting to lay the groundwork for a potential deal between Russia and Ukraine?
Yes, I mean, I don't think it's any surprise that President Trump is going to tackle this fairly early on in his term. He said so. And actually, if you look back over his sort of record, when he says he's going to do something, he tends to do it. So I think he'll talk to the Russians fairly early on. He's appointed a rather good general, Keith Kellogg, to be his front man on Ukraine, which is quite encouraging. And Marco Rubio at the State Department is quite good on Ukraine as well. But I think there are some substantial worries. I think one of them is, does Putin actually want an agreement? Actually, if you looked at it from Putin's point of view, although he's losing a huge number of people and a lot of equipment, he is making progress. And if you looked at it from his point of view, the Ukrainians are struggling to find manpower and want a pause rather more than the Russians do. So, Putin may calculate to himself, actually, he might say to Trump, actually, Donald, if you don't mind, I'm just going to keep going. And that would be a worry. But let's put that to one side, because let's hope. I mean, I think Putin will see the sense of coming to an agreement with Trump, and not not sort of ignoring Trump's peace outreach. So say they do come to an agreement, then I think that, say they do decide to talk, I think there are then a couple of really, really interesting points that then flow from that. The first one is, do the Europeans get a seat at the table? I can actually see a situation in which Trump says, well, actually, let's not complicate it. Let's just do Russia, United States, and possibly Ukraine, at the table. And so that's sort of one option. If you remember back to the Afghan agreement, the Doha Accords, the Europeans weren't really at the table. It was just done between Trump and the Afghans, and the Taliban, in fact. So that is a question. On the other hand, if, as I think is generally accepted as likely, that Trump will say, look, for guarantees for Ukraine's future, it's up to Europe, not the United States, to finance it and to provide the troops. Now, I think this was slightly implicit in what Keir Starmer said yesterday in Kyiv, when he was asked the question, would Britain be willing to send troops to police the border? And he said, yes, we will do our part. And he thought Macron would too. So I think, generally speaking, the Europeans have got the impression, and I think it's probably a good impression, that Trump will want a ceasefire, will want a deal, but will want Europe to provide the peacekeeping forces in a future Ukraine. And therefore, from that point of view, then Europe does have to be at the negotiating table, which is sort of good news. The less good news is the only guarantee that really is worth the paper it's written on is the NATO guarantee, the Article 5 guarantee, which says that if one NATO country is invaded, the others will come to its aid. Now, United States, Germany, Slovakia, and Hungary, and possibly Austria, none of those are prepared to give that guarantee, it seems, the NATO membership to Ukraine. So if it doesn't have NATO membership, what guarantee does Ukraine have that Russia isn't just going to attack again? Well, this is the idea of putting European troops into Ukraine. Well, firstly, Putin may just absolutely reject that notion and say, I'm not having that. But then the other question is, how many troops would it require? Now, it's a 1,200-mile border, a lot longer than the Korean border. and in Korea, there are tens of thousands of American troops. So we need a lot of troops, British, French, I would guess Polish probably, and various other nations would have to stump up troops to patrol the border. Then the question is, are they actually right at the border, or are they in neighboring towns like Kharkov or Sumy or Dnipro or Zaporizhia, back from the border? The danger of being back from the border is that allows Russia to invade 10, 15, 20 miles before actually coming into contact with European troops. And therefore, it's not really acting as a tripwire. If they're right forward at the border, it means that if Russia suddenly decides it's going to crack on again, then you're in a situation in which European countries have to decide, are we going to war? And I mean, I don't know what you think here, but I mean, I really struggle to believe that if Russian troops advanced beyond the agreed line in the face of Polish troops or French troops, that Europe is ready and willing to go to war with Russia, which could have all sorts of consequences, including, use of nuclear weapons further down the line and stuff like this. So it seems to me there are some really massive problems still to be discussed and to be overcome. And not least, incidentally, the question of Britain. I mean, do we have the troops? We find it hard to provision Estonia with 800 troops. We've got some troops in Cyprus. The British Army is the smallest level it's ever been. Could we really supply a meaningful number of troops to Ukraine, given our other commitments elsewhere? I think there's a real question mark over that. So, this whole thing is we're really moving into very unknown territory. It's going to be very, very interesting diplomacy in the weeks ahead, and the United States and Europe are really going to have to be on their game, not to get bested by Putin's diplomatic efforts. Because the other point I think is worth remembering, we're talking as if Putin's sort of somehow sitting in the box seat and that he's in a good position, but he's not. I mean, his invasion has been a catastrophe of Ukraine. He's only taken 17% of Ukraine. He wanted 100% of it. He's lost vast numbers of troops and of equipment. So it would be a real pity to hand him a diplomatic victory on the back of what has been a catastrophic decision of his.
Even if Putin's ambitions don't change, you mentioned there's this consensus among the West that Putin, he might agree to stop further incursions into Europe. But on the other hand, if we were to look at Russia domestically in terms of Putin's reputation among Russians, how do you think that's going to fare? And do you think that will potentially inhibit his ambitions for further incursions?
I think internally, I mean, of course, we never really know because Russia is a very impenetrable place. We never really know how safe Putin is. But my view would be that Putin is in a very strong position in Russia. I think he's a strong man. I think Russians like strong leadership. Incidentally, I think if he were removed, it would be undoubtedly for someone worse, not someone better. I mean, Navalny is dead. Boris Nemtsov is dead. Kara-Murza is in exile. I mean, there is no one. There's no one liberal to take over. And anyway, Russians don't particularly like liberal leaders. They like strong leaders. So I think Putin's actually pretty safe. The way he's run the war in Ukraine is quite clever. So he's drawn people from, he hasn't drawn the troops from middle classes or from Moscow or from St. Petersburg. He's drawn them from, the Far East and sort of middling towns in the east and south and north and so forth. And therefore that has sort of reduced the unpopularity to an extent. And of course, as we know, he's actually had to withdraw. He's had to rely on North Korean troops. I mean, the fact that he's asked North Korea to help shows what a poor position he's in a way. But I think the chances of Putin being overthrown are absolutely minimal. I think there have been chances in the past when Ukraine was doing very well on the battlefield. I'm talking about 18 months ago when they retook Kharkiv, when they retook Kherson. I think there possibly were moments when the Russian army could have mutinied. And if you remember, there was that remarkable Prigozhin coup attempt, where Putin, I think, was at his moment of greatest peril. But now the Russians are beginning to make progress again. I think those dangers of him being overthrown are gone. So the Russians have got this extraordinary ability to take punishment. We saw it in the Second World War, and they'll just grind on and on and on. And this brings us, I think, to the biggest danger. I think the biggest danger is that Putin says to Trump, actually, if you don't mind, I'm not going to do a deal. I'm just going to keep going. And then what happens? Do you
see Trump letting him do that, though?
I don't know what Trump would do, what he could do to stop it. Because, obviously Putin would like the sanctions to be relieved and so forth. But as I say, Russia does have this ability to take punishment. Also, it's still earning quite a lot of money from its gas supplies and its oil supplies around the world. I mean, India, for example, buys an awful lot of Russian oil. So it's getting money in, So the sanctions are partially successful, but not completely successful. What would Trump do? Trump is definitely not prepared to get involved in military stuff in Ukraine. He's not going to want to do that at all. He wants to focus on the Far East and on China and so forth. He doesn't want to be involved in the Middle East, and he doesn't want to be involved in Europe. So he would say, okay, Europe, you sort it out. He would say, look, we are spending 3.4% of our GDP on defense. You guys are spending most of Europe is spending under 2%. It's up to you to sort it out. Over to you guys. What then does Europe do? If Russian troops start to break through Ukrainian lines and start to make big strides, for example, towards Odessa, towards Transnistria, which is that part of Moldova which is Russian, aligned to Russia, towards Georgia, towards Kiev, what does Europe do? That is the big worry. Then Europe has got a decision. Do we intervene? And with all the dangerous consequences that would have, and with militaries which are in really poor shape. I mean, the Finnish army is in good shape. The Polish are in good shape. The Latvians, Lithuanians, Estonians are in pretty good shape. The Swedes are in quite good shape. The British are in very poor shape. The Germans are in disastrous shape. The European military is not a good story.
I'd like to put it to you, if Trump does go ahead and make that decision and he withdraws support from Ukraine and he says, guys, it's up to you in Europe, do you see that in any way backfiring on Trump in the long term, in terms of, trying to protect American interests or enforcing American interests internationally, if he doesn't maintain that relationship with his other NATO allies, with Europe? How's he going to have that supporting base there to help him get what he wants? He's a very transactional man. Do you think that's going to have an impact there?
No, I think it's a really good question, Joanna, because actually America does need NATO. He may not think they need NATO. I mean, NATO is a very effective alliance, one of the most effective alliances in history. And for Trump to be careless with NATO, I'm not saying not helping Europe over Ukraine would end NATO. It wouldn't necessarily, but it would certainly damage it. And as it is, we've got members of NATO like Hungary and Slovakia who are not really signed up to to the obligations that come with NATO membership. So I think it would be dangerous for Trump. And in the future, he worries about China, and who knows? I think NATO may be very important in terms of China in the future. So I think it's a point. I mean, I think the point that Europe needs to make to Trump is, look, and I think there are enough Americans, by the way, enough Republicans in America who believe this, to say to Trump, look, be careful on NATO. It's one thing asking the Europeans to do more, which is a good thing. And incidentally, I think the Americans are right on this. We've been casual with our defense. We've relied too much on the Americans. So we do need to do more. But to go a bit too far and actually damage NATO would be a bad thing. And I think Marco Rubio, the new Secretary of State, and I think various other key members of the administration will say that to Trump, that further down the line, when we're more worried about China, we're gonna need NATO. So no, I think that's a very fair point.
Russia, Ukraine, but also the rest of Europe, they need time to reinvest in their military arsenal, if for whatever is planned to happen first. How would you say that Russia is going to be able to respond to that, to build back its provisions, but also its manpower? And how would you compare that to Ukraine and the rest of Europe?
Yeah, that's also a good question. So Russia actually has already impressively been replacing some of the tanks that it's lost and stuff. It's really cranked up its industry rather effectively. And if you remember in the early days of the war, when Ukraine was so much better at drone technology than the Russians, but the Russians' drone technology has caught up now. So they've done pretty well on the equipment side. They're short of soldiers, but of course, they could probably get a lot more from North Korea and others. So on the manpower side, I think Ukraine is in the weaker position than Russia, much weaker, because the cohort of Ukrainians that volunteered back in February 2022, many of them are still on the front line, and they're saying, "Look, guys, we've done our bit. Where are all the other people? What about all the people who went off to Europe, went off to UK or Poland or whatever? Why don't they come back and fight?" And I think we've reached a stage where, the serious questions are being asked about manpower, and I think Zelensky would like to recruit sort of younger people as well, but there's a certain reluctance. So I think there's that question as well. On the European side, I think another important thing is when we're talking to Trump, we need to use those people in Europe who will get through to him. Now, Keir Starmer, I think, has done a great job going to Kyiv, by the way. I think it's a very good thing that you went to Kyiv, and I think he said all the right things. I think you can ask a question about the 100-year partnership. I mean, quite honestly, a 10-year partnership would be good. I don't think you need to exaggerate by calling it a 100-year partnership. But, Giorgia Meloni, right-wing Italian leader, she will have impact in Washington. Donald Tusk, not as right-wing, obviously, but they spend 4.1% of their GDP on defense. So I'd have Meloni and Tusk going to Washington and making the case. But I think Starmer's done well over the last few days. What we mustn't do as Britain is now announce a really weak strategic defense review. If we come out with a strategic defense review which is not impressive, and it looks as if it won't be impressive, it would be better not to announce it than to announce it at this moment in history, which will let the whole of the rest of the world know that, our defense is probably at its weakest stage since the Napoleonic Wars.
Mm. And picking up on your point about how Russia might have to depend more on North Korea in terms of troops, but also military supplies, I think a key image from Trump's first administration was that meeting between him and the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un. Do you think that his relationship, even though, there's questions about just how significant diplomatically that meeting was between the two leaders, do you think that relationship between Trump and the North Korean leader could have any impact or, potentially, cause problems between Putin and the North Korean leader's relationship as well?
I don't, actually. I mean, I think Kim Jong-un saw Trump coming. There was this so-called bromance, if you remember, where they seemed to be getting on so well together. But, in terms of United States objectives, they got nowhere near nuclear disarmament of North Korea. And Kim Jong-un has not got the slightest intention of disarming. So I would hope Trump has now recognized that was not one of his greatest moments. I think the idea that Trump could come between Kim Jong-un and Putin is for the birds. Just not going to happen. Actually, the Putin-Kim Jong-un relationship from a North Korean point of view has worked rather well, and from a Russian point of view has worked rather well. So that's interesting. The other interesting one is, of course, Iran. Putin's relationship with Iran had blossomed, but Iran has taken a terrible beating over the last few months. You know, the damage to Hezbollah in Lebanon, then losing its great ally Assad in Syria. So, although Iran, you know, North Korea is a sort of relatively strong ally, although I think, incidentally, a lot of its artillery rounds it supplies to Russia are very, very old and very unreliable. Nonetheless, Iran is much weaker. But it does, doesn't it? It does point out that there are global aspects to this war. I mean, this is a war that reaches also into Iran and into North Korea, which is another reason why, I think it would be undoubtedly a good thing for all concerned for this war to finish. It's been a brutal war, vast amount of damage, but it's got to be finished in a way that doesn't hand Putin a diplomatic victory as a reward for what was a catastrophically bad decision.